All right, so last week when we last got to meet, we really just kind of got to introduce a little bit of anatomy on the heart. Got to talk about its structure with the four chambers, two atria, which are the upper receiving chambers, two ventricles, which are the two lower pumping chambers. And we learned that there's right side and left side of the heart, two independent sides, two sides responsible for pumping blood to two different regions of the body. Our heart wall, we learned about it. We're going to talk more about the myocardium today, which is where the contracting heart muscle is. That's the most important part physiologically for us, and so we'll talk about it. We also learned the pericardium, as well as the blood vessels associated with the heart. We'll talk a little bit about the aorta, the pulmonary trunk today, which are the blood vessels that receive blood from our two ventricles. Pulmonary trunk, which receives blood from our right ventricle, the aorta, which receives blood from our left ventricle. We got to talk about differences between the atria and the ventricles with size, and even got to talk about the differences in the right and left sides with their thicknesses. And we'll talk about the pressures that the left ventricle has to pump against, and the pressures or the pressure that the right ventricle has to pump against, which influences their size. So kind of helps to reiterate what we got to talk about last week. Associated with those four chambers of our heart are four different heart valves. These are very important, very similar to the valves that we talked about in our lymphatic system that allow blood, in this case, instead of lymph, in that case, to flow in one direction, at least in a healthy heart valve, should prevent retrograde or backwards flow. Now, these valves will only open and close in response to pressure changes. And pressure changes occur as the heart contracts and relaxes. We classify the four heart valves into two categories. The two upper, or not two upper, but the two atrioventricular valves are associated with the atria and the ventricles, hence their name atrioventricular. Okay. You have a tricuspid, which we can see here with a closed tricuspid, has three flaps, hence the name tricuspid. Located between the right atrium and the right ventricle. It is also known as your right atrioventricular or right AV valve. Okay. Then you've got a bicuspid, which we see here as two flaps, which is why it's called the bicuspid. It's also known as a mitral valve or the left AV valve, and it's located between the left atrium and the left ventricles. They open up when the atria contract and push the blood into the ventricles. Okay. So they're also going to close to prevent blood from flowing back into them when our ventricles contract. And that's what we can show off with our bottom two images there. Because of the chordae tendineae, which are little string-like tendons attached to little muscles called papillary muscles on the floor of the ventricles. If you've taken anatomy, which every single one of you has, you've gotten to see this, or you will get to see this in lab when we dissect the heart, which will be coming up. Their semilunar valves are not as large, but they're very important. They are associated with the outflow of blood from the heart. We've got a pulmonary valve, which is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and then a aortic valve, which is associated with the left ventricle and the aorta. And they will let blood out of the ventricles, but not back into them. And here's what they look like as they open and close. Here, letter A, the AV valves are open in both the right and left sides, allowing blood to be ejected from our right atrium and left atrium into the ventricles. They then dump that blood out into the ventricles and close. Okay, and they prevent the blood from going backwards. Okay, then the ventricles contract and eject the blood out of the heart into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So that means the semilunar valves must be open, and then they close once the blood has left the heart. This is a very simple demonstration of the cardiac cycle, which is something that we're going to talk about in greater detail here in just a minute. First, I want to talk about the means in which blood is able to leave the heart and flow back into it. It all relates to pressure gradients, which we've talked about now leading back to our last lecture on the lymphatic system, which involved the flow of lymph, which was also due to pressure gradients. Okay? We learned previously that the lymphatic system did not have a central pumping organ like the heart, but our heart is associated with our cardiovascular system that can establish a much greater pressure gradient in how it contracts. And it all relates to Newton's laws of motion applied to fluids. And we've got stated here with the first number, a fluid will not flow when pressure is the same throughout. We always abbreviate pressures with P sub 1, P sub 2, P sub 3. Just means pressure in one area, pressure in another area. The unit of measure for pressure is millimeters of mercury. That's for fluid. That's also for air. And so we'll talk about barometric pressure when we talk about breathing. We'll talk about pressure in our blood when we talk about this right now. Okay. If we see P1 and P2 both being 80, there is no pressure gradient because those numbers, you guys would all agree with me, are the same. Okay, so in this case, blood flow will not occur. So if we pretend this is our left ventricle and this is our aorta, we aren't going to see any ejection of blood. When the ventricles contract, they generate a lot of pressure, and we can see there's a higher pressure now in our left ventricle, if that's what we're talking about here, than our aorta. So blood would flow from high pressure to low pressure. And we talked about this a little bit in our last lecture. Now, when I say here, how does blood move, I said part 1. Part 2 will go into our next lecture when we throw in blood vessels. And it makes it a little bit trickier because we have resistance. That is something that you don't have in your heart. This slide is a review of stuff we've actually talked a little bit about before, not only in this class, but in human anatomy. We previously learned that cardiac muscle is striated, just like we saw skeletal muscle, because it has the same arrangement of thick and thin filaments and sarcomeres and all that wonderful stuff that we know all about. And cells of cardiac tissue are called cardiac myocytes. You also see them just called cardiac muscle fibers. And you can see that here with our figure at the bottom, just called cardiac muscle fiber. Each of those myocytes is joined end to end by thick connections of the sarcolemma called intercalated discs. And that's something that we've learned before. We've also learned before that some of the cardiac muscle fibers or myocytes are branched or forked. We can see a good one right there. Okay. Associated with those intercalated discs are 3 important structures. These first 2 help hold those fibers together. We've got interdigitating folds, which are these little finger-like extensions increasing cell surface area or surface area for intercellular contact, like taking your fingers, locking them in together, fitting together like a puzzle. Okay? And then on top of that, we've got desmosomes, which are like welding the cells together. If you know what welding is, it's how you can join 2 pieces of metal. Okay? So they help really tighten up the connection because those cells are going to pull on one another, and we don't want them pulling apart and snapping from one another. Like, if you break a string, we don't want that to happen. The most important thing that we're going to talk about are these gap junctions that exist. They're like little open doorways that allow ions to flow from one cell directly into a neighboring cell. And we know that when ions flow, changes in resting membrane potential also occur. Because, for example, if sodium flows from one cell to another cell, it's going to depolarize. And just like we saw in neurons in skeletal muscle, if you depolarize enough, you're going to reach threshold. And that's the same thing that's happening here. So it allows for action potentials to spread from one cell to another, which is important. And that's demonstrated here at the very last half of our sentence, causing all cells or connecting cells to contract in unison. Because as we're going to see, the way that the heart contracts is a very coordinated manner in order for blood to be ejected in the correct way. of our cardiac myocytes are described as being autorhythmic. This is a term we've learned before. Auto means self, okay, and rhythmic refers to its ability to depolarize at regular time intervals. It sets its own rhythm. Okay. It creates its own action potentials. And this occurs because during development, some of the myocytes become specialized for generating action potentials, and they constitute what we call the cardiac conduction system. So basically, some of those muscle fibers become more like neurons, generating and conducting action potentials through the walls of the heart. And this controls the route and timing of electrical conduction in our heart. It all begins with our natural pacemaker. I say natural because you can have automated or artificial pacemakers put in. Our body is always built with, or should be anyway, its own natural pacemaker. What we call the SA node, which is short for sinoatrial node, which are a patch of myocytes in the right atrium under the epicardium near our superior vena cava. Signals from the SA node will spread throughout the atria and initiate atrial contraction. Okay. Atria, remember, is plural because not only are signals going to be sent from the SA node through the right atrium where it's located, but it'll also cross over to the left atrium. And that's what these purple arrows are demonstrating. SA node is our pacemaker initiating each heartbeat and determines heart rate by initiating a pacemaker potential. Just a simple depolarization of the SA node, which is what we're showing down here. And every so often, and it's very, very coordinated and set in stone, somewhat anyway in this case, we're going from negative 60 to threshold. Okay. It's not very far from negative 60 to negative 55, so it's pretty easy to reach threshold and create an action potential. And each time an action potential is generated here, it's going to spread throughout both atria. Okay. Some of those signals will travel to this guy, our next part of the cardiac conduction system. Okay. The importance is associated with the SA node. Not only it creates the action potential in the atria, but it also causes those atria to contract. Because just like in skeletal muscle, when it becomes excited, or when the muscle fibers in the heart become excited, they contract. Okay. So we describe the process after atrial depolarization, atrial contraction. Our AV node is our next node located in the inner atrial septum. Something important takes place here, and that's the action potential delaying or slowing considerably. We call this an AV node delay. This is important because it provides time for the atria to finish contracting and dumping the blood into the ventricles. Okay, because what good is the heart if the ventricles are pumping before they're even receiving blood? The answer to that is not. Okay, we need the ventricles to contract after the atria have completed their contraction. From the AV node, action potential will spread through what we call the AV bundle or bundle of His, and then fork into bundle branches, which then run through the rest of the interventricular septum, and then take an upward turn through what we call the Purkinje fibers. And Purkinje fibers are important because they are going to allow the action potential to spread throughout the ventricular myocardium, and that's going to cause the ventricles to contract, pushing blood up towards our semilunar valves, and if they contract hard enough, eject the blood through those aortic and pulmonary valves. If you left the SA node alone, it would establish a heart rate that would never change. But we know our heart rate is definitely subject to change. We've talked all semester, not all semester, but quite a bit this semester about fight or flight and rest and digest and hormones like adrenaline or epinephrine. What are those different things going to do? They're going to change the rate at which our heart beats. But they don't establish the original signal. The signal comes from the SA node, but the SA node is subject to outside influence. And that's what the last paragraph is stating. As I've mentioned already several times, when those action potentials spread through the atria and the ventricles, they do so by way of those gap junctions, and then they contract. So we can measure action potentials in those contractile cells, in those myocytes, which we can see is quite a bit different than what we saw in both neurons and skeletal muscle. Action potential in those contractile fibers of both atria and ventricles involves 3 phases. The first phase is a depolarization phase, just like we saw in neurons and in skeletal muscle. This time, we're starting much lower at resting membrane potential of -90. Okay. Quite a bit lower than -70 of neurons that we saw a lot about action potentials. Okay. We have a very rapid rise to +20. Okay. It's not delayed out or drug out. It's almost instantaneous, the depolarization process. Because, once again, it's the same thing, sodium inflow. But this time, we have what we call voltage-gated fast sodium channels opening up. Okay. We call them fast channels because they allow a heck of a lot of sodium to rush in really, really, really fast. Okay. Now, what we saw back in neurons and in skeletal muscle is after depolarization, we return right back to repolarization. We went up, then we went right back down, right? This time, we start to go back down, but then we hold steady. So we call the second step the plateau phase, where the depolarization is maintained. And that's why we see this also being colored green. Okay. It is due to calcium inflow through voltage-gated slow calcium channels and potassium outflow through voltage-gated potassium channels. Remember, we depolarized in neurons with sodium in and in potassium out. Here we have potassium going out, but at the same time we have calcium coming in. So positive leaving and positive entering. What does that mean? The membrane potential doesn't change. Or if it does, it's very little change. Now eventually, we are going to have to repolarize. And that's our third step. Okay. The calcium channels close, potassium continues to flow out. And then we return back to resting membrane potential. Why this is important is demonstrated with the last bit of text. The refractory period in cardiac muscle fibers will last longer than the contraction itself. Remember we talked about refractory periods, and I kind of used an example or analogy of jumping in the air, where you can't jump a second time until you've hit the ground the first time. After the first jump is complete, then you can do the second jump. Well, you can think of in cardiac muscle fibers, the jump up means that we float back down. And so we stay in the air for a longer period of time before we can jump again. Why this is actually important is demonstrated here with our last sentence. The contraction is delayed, therefore the heart can refill with blood. So like I said, what good is the heart if it's not filling up with blood? That's its overall job. Pump blood. Does that make sense? Good. All right, a little bit more here on gap junctions before we move on from those. Because of those gap junctions, the electrostatic attraction can cause ion movement between depolarized membrane of an active cardiac myocyte to the membrane of a neighboring resting cell, causing it to depolarize, once again allowing for those muscle fibers to all contract in unison. Okay. So we can see here at rest, -90, depolarized somewhere +20. That depolarization can spread from cell to cell by way of these things that are like open doorways. And then they can go through those various steps that we just talked about. Now, the way that the action potentials spread through our heart can be detected and amplified by a machine known as an electrocardiograph. which provides us with an electrocardiogram, which is the ECG that you best know it as. Demonstrated over here on the right with our figure, many detectable signals of an ECG. There are many. Okay, the first is the P wave, a small upward deflection on the ECG representing atrial depolarization. Okay, and when depolarization occurs, once again, contraction also occurs. And you can see that up here at the top, our blue shaded box, we call atrial contraction. Okay, which our second step also involves atrial contraction. Our PQ interval, or as it says, PQ segments. Time between the P wave and the next wave represents the time required for impulses to travel from our SA node to our AV node. Okay. The QRS complex is by far the most discernible piece of action in our ECG. It involves a small downward deflection called the Q, a very sharp rise R, big downward S. So we call it a QRS complex. This signal is produced when the action potentials from the AV node will spread through the ventricular myocardium, which we call ventricular depolarization. Begins or represents the beginning of ventricular systole. Systole being contraction. We'll talk about the words systole and diastole a little bit more here in just a second. Okay. We've got another segment, the P or ST segment, which represents the period from the end of S to the beginning of T. And this represents time during which the ventricles contract and are ejecting blood. And you can see that here with our yellow box, ventricular contraction. The T wave is our second or third wave. Third part, really kind of discernible deflection here. Dome-shaped upward deflection generated by ventricular repolarization, so the ventricles are repolarizing and resting. QT represents beginning of ventricular depolarization to the end of ventricular repolarization. You will need to know what these different things represent. You also might see an ECG on the test where I highlight or show off different parts and you'll have to tell me what's happening, whether it's a P wave or it's Q or what's actually happening. So know everything on this figure or know everything on this slide, I should say, is the moral of that story. Here on our next page really is kind of a neat figure demonstrating what's happening in the ECG, but also what's actually happening within the heart. Okay, step one, P wave, beginning of depolarization of atria. Okay, then that causes the atria to contract, and we can see that the atria are squeezing in on one another. We call that the atrial systole or contraction part. From P to the QRS, we call that the PQ segment or interval. QRS, the ventricles are depolarizing. You can see in red. Red represents repolarization. Okay, but this is what would show up, the QRS being ventricular depolarization. After they depolarize, just like the atria, the ventricles will contract. Call this ventricular systole. Okay, then they eject the blood and then have to repolarize, and that's where T comes into play. That point from T to P is where the heart is completely relaxed, both ventricles and atria, and then we start all over again. Make sense? Here we have several figures demonstrating issues with an ECG. The letter A there is a normal ECG. We have a first degree AV block. This is something I'm not really going to get into, but you can see there's a longer PQ interval than what it should be. Atriofibular, AFib, as a lot of people will call it, will show up as no detectable P waves and irregular RR intervals. VTAC and VFib, or ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation, you can see are very, very complex looking, really bad situations. It looks like little kid scribbles, not a typical QRS, P, T, any of that can be found. So stuff is not currently working the way it should. And you guys all know when somebody flatlines, as they like to call it, there's nothing, the line goes straight across. And you see that all the time in movies. What does that mean? Well, the person's heart is not doing anything, and it needs a jolt to get it going again. A lot of these can be treated in a variety of means. You can get a lot just from looking at ECGs. I know a lot of people, that's just their job, is specifically to look at an ECG. I didn't talk about this in my class earlier today, but I'll tell you guys this story. I had a professor at K-State when I went to school there tell me his job was to do stress tests on individuals before he became a teacher. And stress tests where you hook somebody up to an ECG and then you run them on a treadmill, see what happens to the heart as a result. It tells a lot about what's, the person's health is. Anyway, to put an ECG on a person can be a pretty uncomfortable situation because it involves electrodes running basically down the left side of the breast, underneath of the breast, especially for a guy doing it with a female for obvious reasons. So he said his kind of technique for doing it was to lift the breast tissue with his left forearm and then place the electrodes with his right hand. He said, and he was working with a rather large female at the time, that he did that to lift, and a french fry popped out. So that was, I think, a point when he decided the career change was ready. All right, so we've already talked today about the cardiac cycle a little bit. As we've learned, atria and ventricles depolarize at different times because of the cardiac conduction system and how the action potentials are routed in that specific pathway. Cardiac cycle refers to the steps involved in one complete heartbeat and consists of two major parts, systole and diastole. Okay. Systole, which represents contraction of the heart, can be both atrial systole and ventricular. And then you've got diastole, which is where the heart is relaxed, which can be both atrial and ventricular. Together, we can basically combine those different components into 5 major cardiac cycle steps. Okay. The first is atrial systole. I believe on the next page I just call it atrial contraction, which is obviously, based on its name, contraction of the atria. Increases pressure within the atria, causing blood to be ejected from the atria into our ventricles. For this to occur, our ventricles must be relaxed. Otherwise, pressure would be too high in the ventricles, and a pressure gradient would not be established. End of atrial systole is also the end of ventricular diastole, which we just learned diastole is the word for relaxation. Each ventricle contains about 130 mils of blood. Okay? This blood volume we call the end diastolic volume, EDV, the volume of blood at the end of diastole. At this point, then our ventricles are ready to contract, and that's what step 2 is. Isovolumetric contraction, which is the beginning of ventricular systole. All the valves are closed, pressure within the ventricles are drastically increased. Contraction of cardiac muscle fibers consists of an isometric contraction because the force is not great enough to cause them to shorten. Okay, so a couple weeks ago we talked about isotonic and isometric contractions. You guys remember the difference? What's an isometric contraction? Has to do with changing or not changing of length. Isometric is where they don't change length. So like doing a wall sit. In this case, the heart's contracting, but it's not shortening because it's not generating quite enough pressure yet. So it's a very short period before it does shorten. And when those muscle fibers shorten, guess what happens to the blood? It gets squeezed out. That's what ventricular ejection is, step 3. Okay. And this only will occur if pressure inside of the ventricles exceeds pressure outside of them. In our aorta, in our pulmonary trunk. And it causes those semilunar valves to open and blood to be ejected. We talked about the size differential between the left ventricle and the right ventricle last week. And that the left ventricle must pump against higher pressures. And pressure within the left ventricle must rise to somewhere around 120 millimeters of mercury. And our right ventricle only has to climb to about 25 to 30. Now, the amount of blood they pump is pretty much the same, about 70 mils of blood, which was not everything that was put into it. Okay, it only pumps out about half of what it received. Okay. So what's left over is called the end systolic volume, and it's just end diastolic. All right, no, we'll get to that. Sorry, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Okay. But it's 130 minus 70, which gives you 60. Isovolumetric relaxation occurs next. Beginning of ventricular diastole, when all the valves become closed again, pressure in the ventricles must drastically decrease, because we're decreasing pressure to try to bring blood back into them. Okay, establishing pressure the opposite way now, not out but in. Okay, and that allows us to then refill the ventricles, which is step 5. Okay, and that occurs when the ventricular pressure drops below atrial pressure, causing the tricuspid and bicuspid valves open, blood to get sucked into the ventricles. At the end of this phase, ventricles are about 3/4 full. Here on the next page, we can see a whole bunch of different things occurring during the 5 phases. Okay? We have 2 cycles actually being demonstrated. The beginning of the second is shown over here on the right. The beginning of the first is shown with our first 5 boxes. Okay? We've got in pink box here atrial contraction or atrial systole. You can see the atria are contracting, injecting blood into the ventricles. Okay? And as you would imagine, the volume in the ventricles, we're going to just measure the left ventricle, I'm guessing here, is going up. Okay? Because we're pumping blood into it. Okay? We'll talk about heart sounds a little bit here in a second. Okay? Remember, the atria contract from P to Q. Okay? So you can see atrial systole demonstrated up here with our ECG. This figure here is demonstrating the pressure changes that occur. We've got 3 pressures being measured. Pressure in the aorta, pressure in the left ventricle, pressure in the left atria. Okay? During atrial systole, the pressure in the atria is higher than the ventricle. Okay? Because it has to be a pressure gradient higher to lower, right? Doesn't have to be much higher for this to occur, for blood to be ejected from the atria into the ventricles. Okay. Then the atria relax, and the ventricles start to pump. For a very short amount of time, the ventricles contract, but don't shorten. Look what happens to pressure, though. It goes way up. Okay. And then it exceeds pressure in the aorta, and the aortic valve opens. And look what happens to volume. It goes way down because it's pumping the blood out. We call that ventricular ejection. Okay. Then we relax the heart. Specifically, the ventricles relax. Pressure drops. It's going to help bring back blood into the ventricles, which is step 5, ventricular refilling. Or, as it says on the previous page, just ventricular filling. Okay. And that's because we've drastically dropped pressure in the ventricles below atrial pressure. Okay. And then we can start the whole process over again. Pretty cool, huh? So we've talked a lot about action potentials and contractions. We know that action potentials and contractions can be described with excitation-contraction coupling, that wonderful stuff that we got to learn about and I tested you on not that long ago. The process of excitation-contraction coupling in cardiac muscle fibers is the same as it is, or similar anyway, to what it is in skeletal muscle fibers. Action potentials will spread over the sarcolemma, down into the T-tubes. Calcium is triggered to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Calcium binds to troponin, shifts in tropomyosin, cross bridges are formed, power stroke, detachment, yada, yada, yada. You guys know this all by now, so I'm not going to get into it anymore than this. All right? All right, on that figure a couple slides ago, we said or showed that there were a couple heart sounds that happen at various steps in the cardiac cycle. We know, and this is a term that we learned all the way at the beginning of the semester, that auscultation is a fancy way to describe listening to sounds within the body, performed with a stethoscope. These heart sounds come primarily from the turbulence of blood when the heart valves close. There are typically 4 heart sounds, but in normal conditions, only the first and second can be heard, S1 and S2. S1 can be described as a love sound, a bit longer than the second sound. It occurs when blood turbulence, or from it, blood turbulence associated with closure of the AV valves. The AV valves are the valves between the atria and the ventricle. Okay. So this is after the ventricles have contracted. The second sound, S2, is the duct sound. That is generated when the SL valves close, those semilunar valves close, which are the valves located between the ventricles and the outflow vessels, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay, so when you listen to somebody's heart, you can hear it repeated, lup, dup, lup, dup, lup, dup. S3 and S4 normally not loud enough to be heard, but S3 is due to turbulence of blood during rapid ventricular filling. S4 is due to blood turbulence during atrial systole. I do expect you to know the 4 sounds and what causes them. Okay, the last thing that we're really going to talk about, and this lasts for several slides, is how much blood our heart can pump, which is dependent, or is completely dependent upon the events going on with the body. As we know, right here at rest, your heart doesn't have to work out, or doesn't have to work as hard as when you are working out. Like during exercise, your working muscles need more nutrients like oxygen. Therefore, we must pump more blood to them. We can measure the amount of blood our heart pumps with a calculation of heart rate times stroke volume, where heart rate is the number of beats your heart takes in a minute. Just simple, can be measured by just taking your pulse and counting for 1 minute or a fraction of a minute and multiplying. And we generally use beats per minute or BPMs to describe heart rate. Somewhere around 75 beats a minute, and at rest can elevate as much as 200 beats a minute. Obviously, and we'll talk about this later today, that's dependent upon your health, endurance, fitness, and your age. Because as we get older, our heart rate should get lower. And they say 200 because your heart rate should be 220 minus your age. Your max heart rate should be anyway. And most of you guys are probably around 20. So 200 beats a minute is what your max out at. Your stroke volume is a little more complex than just counting up how many beats you're taking. This is the amount of blood that's ejected per heartbeat. I always think, instead of saying heartbeat, you can think of as heart stroke. It's the name stroke volume. So every time your heart beats, how much blood is pumping out? It's about 0.72 to 1 liter, 70 mils to 100 mils at rest. Can rise to 130 during intense exercise. Okay. That figure a couple of slides ago actually showed you what stroke volume was, but it's a result of EDV minus ESV, the volume at the end of at rest or diastole, minus what's at the end of contraction or systole. Together, those 2 factors contribute to cardiac output. So as you can see with the equation at the bottom, cardiac output is the overall total measure of blood ejected from the heart per minute, which is what we measure as liters per minute. 4 to 6 at rest for most healthy people, can rise somewhere around 20 in intense exercise. If you really want to see what happens when you train your body, that's what this graph or table will show you. Showing untrained men and women, trained men and women at rest and during exercise. Okay. Notice at rest, cardiac output is not different. Okay. But look at the other 2 things that go, or the 2 things that go into it. Heart rate will lower at rest the better in shape we are. We call this concept bradycardia. But they have similar cardiac outputs because they can pump more blood each time they do it. Okay. And that overall results in a difference when we see it at exercise. Okay, look at the difference. 22 for an untrained male versus 34 in a trained, and 18 and 23 for untrained and trained females. Heart rate's actually lower, but look at the huge difference in stroke volume. This isn't something I'm going to talk or ask you to know on the test. It's actually something I pulled from my exercise phys book. But it's just kind of cool to see what training your body can do as far as your heart goes. A healthy, in shape individual doesn't have to pump their heart as much in a day. You know, say 20 less times a minute at rest. Times that by how many minutes there are in a day. Times that by how many minutes there are in a week. Times a year. Over a lifetime, that's a significant amount. So, moral of the story is, get in shape. A lot of benefits. All right, for the next 2 slides, I want to talk about ways to alter stroke volume. 3 factors affect stroke volume. 2 are called extrinsic, relating to factors outside the heart, and then 1 within the heart itself, which we call intrinsic factors. So the 2 extrinsic factors, preload, which is described as the amount of stretch placed on the ventricular myocardium before it contracts. If you increase preload or filling pressure, it's going to increase the force of contraction, therefore a greater volume of blood will be ejected, which means stroke volume is increased. Okay. It has to do with that length-tension relationship that we learned about. The ideal crossover of or ideal stretch of the muscle or the sarcomeres within the muscle, therefore affecting cross bridges. And normal resting length, stroke volume is pretty low. The length of the muscle is very low, but by stretching it more, stroke volume goes up because the contraction is stronger. Okay, so any increase in preload increases stroke volume, as you can see over here on the board that I wrote down at 9 o'clock. This phenomenon is described as the Frank-Starling law. Preload is proportional to end-diastolic volume, which is affected by the duration of ventricular diastole and venous return. Venous return, we'll talk more about on Friday, is the amount of blood that's returned back to the right ventricle from our venous circulation. Afterload is a negative pressure associated with stroke volume. Any increase in afterload will decrease stroke volume. So to increase stroke volume, you want to decrease afterload. Okay. This is the amount of pressure that the heart must exceed to eject blood. If it's high, the heart can't pump out as much blood. Okay. That's why hypertension or high blood pressure is dangerous. Okay. It can lead to bad things within the heart. Same thing for atherosclerosis, which we know is where the arteries get clogged full of plaque. Okay. Contractility is the amount of force or how strong the heart can contract. So if you increase contractility, it means your heart is going to pump harder. And any harder pump means that stroke volume goes up. Things that will increase it are positive inotropic agents, like stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. If you ever get that fight or flight response, you feel like your heart's about to beat out of its chest because it's pumping really hard, that's what's happening. Okay. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, we know those are hormones activated for release whenever the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Calcium is also a positive inotropic agent. And then negative inotropic agents decrease contractility, like inhibiting the sympathetic nervous system, acidosis, and increased potassium levels. And you can see, overall, those are going to decrease stroke volume, whereas positives will increase it. Now, stroke volume is one way to affect cardiac output. The other way, as we know, is affecting heart rates. And adjustments in heart rate are very important in short-term control of cardiac output and blood pressure. We'll talk more about heart rate and blood pressure in our next lecture. If you left the SA node alone, it would set a constant heart rate of about 100 beats a minute. As we know, that's not the case because of various mechanisms occurring in our body. We can trace back our heart rate to the cardiovascular center in our medulla oblongata. And we've talked about this for quite a while now. This region of the brainstem is what initiates signals coming out for the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. It will do so in response to information coming in. So we know sensory is going to affect our motor response. Sensory information will be through what we call proprioceptors from our joints, chemoreceptors monitoring chemical concentrations, and baroreceptors monitoring blood pressure. We'll talk about those more in our next lecture. You've also got higher brain centers like your cortex. Okay. Thinking about something might get you jacked up or something like that. What's our limbic system again? What's its nickname? Emotional brain. Think about an emotion and how that might affect your heart rate. I always use getting cheated on. You don't have to tell me if you've ever been cheated on, but think about if you have. Probably just thinking about it might raise your heart rates and your blood pressure. But the output is what we're going to focus on right now, which we know there's two outputs, sympathetic and parasympathetic, since these are autonomically controlled regions of our body. The heart is, that is. And the sympathetic nervous stimulation involves interactions with the SA node, the AP node, most portions of the myocardium. It involves what we call cardiac accelerator nerves. That's exactly what it sounds like. It accelerates the heart, meaning it pumps more often, which means that heart rate is elevated. And so any increase in sympathetic increases heart rate. Any increase in sympathetic also increases stroke volume because it increases contractility. And therefore, cardiac output goes up as a result of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. Parasympathetic decreases heart rate. This involves those vagus nerves that release acetylcholine, okay, which decreases the rate at which the SA node depolarizes. Okay. Now, very little or few vagus nerve fibers innervate the muscle of the ventricles, meaning it doesn't do very much to contractility. So as you can see, I put sideways arrows for stroke volume under parasympathetic. Overall, though, that does decrease cardiac output. Here's how it works. Over here on the left, when norepinephrine binds to receptors on the SA node, it means that the second messenger system is activated. Sodium flows in more often, therefore more pacemaker potentials are created. Therefore, the heart is contracted more often. Whereas over here, for parasympathetic, when acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors, two things happen. Potassium flows out. That causes hyperpolarization. We block off the sodium channels, which means that it's less likely that we hit threshold. Therefore, heart rate is lowered because the pacemaker potentials are generated less often. Cool stuff. Not really stuff I'm really going to get into too much, but it's there. Other things can affect cardiac output. Hormones. I've already mentioned this, like epi and norepi, increase heart rate and contractility. So they both increase cardiac output, or both aspects of cardiac output. The thyroid hormones T3 and T4 do the same thing. Increase stroke volume by increasing contractility and heart rates. Cations like potassium, calcium, and sodium all have a large effect on cardiac function. Potassium and sodium will decrease it and heart rate and contractility. So they both decrease cardiac output. Okay. Calcium will speed it up and strengthen heartbeat, so that increases heart rate and stroke volume, therefore increasing cardiac output. Other factors, age. Babies have a higher heart rate at rest, and, well, babies don't exercise, but they should have a resting heart rate of 120 beats per minute. The older we get, the lower it should be. Okay. Females typically have a higher heart rate than men. Never really researched why. Bradycardia is something I was talking about earlier, where if we get in better shape, our heart doesn't have to beat as often. And so physically fit individuals exhibit a lower heart rate. Increasing body temperature, like in fever or exercise, will increase heart rates. Decreasing it will decrease heart rates. Here is a figure that just brings in together all the different things that will affect cardiac output, the things that affect stroke volume, things that affect heart rates. Just a nice summary slide. All right, that's all I got for you guys. Have a fantastic rest of your day.